A late night at her workplace broke the barriers we'd painstakingly constructed, altering everything between us. One unguarded moment. I had assumed that this would be simply another job, one more step up the ladder, but entering that environment felt like crossing into something completely unexpected. My new boss. Diane was unlike anybody I had ever dealt with. She was bright and constantly one step ahead. She was the kind of person who could dominate a whole room without saying anything. When she initially greeted me, her grin was warm yet restrained, as if she was already assessing me in ways I couldn't comprehend. I will never forget our first actual encounter. It occurred after a hard meeting in which I barely kept up with the topics. I was attempting to return to my work when I felt her attention on me. "May I visit you in my office?" For a moment, she asked politely but without hesitation, and my heart skipped a beat as I followed her down the corridor, wondering what I had already done wrong. Instead of reprimanding, she just waved to the chair opposite her desk and sat down with a sigh, as if she had let her guard down for the first time all day. "The first weeks may be rough," she remarked with a small grin, her voice softer than I'd heard before. "Isn't there a lot to absorb?" I nodded, thankful for her understanding. We spoke for a bit, and she told me about her first job, the errors she made, and how she learned to pick herself up and go on. "There's something about you," she continued thoughtfully, almost to herself, and I felt a weird sense of pride. It was the first indication that she considered me more than simply another young employee. I had no idea that moment would mark the start of something I had never imagined. Things felt different after that. Diane started incorporating me in additional initiatives, soliciting my feedback during meetings, and inviting me into her office after hours for brief conversations that lasted longer than I anticipated. Each contact seemed like she was introducing me to her world slowly and gently, as if she was testing the waters. Then there were the late hours. She was often one of the last persons in the workplace, which was something we had in common. I'd find myself in her office long after everyone else had gone, discussing strategy, brainstorming ideas, or just working quietly side by side. She had a way of making me feel important, as if my opinions counted and I was her equal. Despite our differing experiences, she approached me near the coffee machine one evening after a long day of back-to-back meetings. "You seem like you could need something stronger." She chuckled, her eyes flashing with the rare humor she saved for occasions away from the formality of work. "A long day." I smiled back. "I'm not sure coffee is cutting it," she replied, looking around the vacant office. "What about a change of scenery? There's a nice small restaurant just around the block." I was taken off guard. I wasn't accustomed to managers simply asking me to a drink after work, particularly ones like her. The little pub she led me to was quiet and dimly lit, with a laid-back appeal that seemed far removed from the hustle and bustle of the workplace. She ordered a drink, leaning back with a satisfied sigh. "I often wonder whether this work is worth it," she remarked, almost as if to herself, swirling her glass as she talked. I was astounded to see someone so composed and in control. Admitting to uncertainties seemed weird. She stared at me with a sense of vulnerability in her eyes. "It's funny," she says. "Everything might feel different depending on who you encounter along the road." Her eyes caught mine for a second longer than normal, and I felt a peculiar flutter, as if we had passed some invisible line from that night on. We seemed to have reached a quiet accord. We didn't talk about it, but there was a new energy between us that I couldn't exactly describe. During meetings, I would sometimes catch her staring at me from across the room, her stare lingering just a second too long and her face inscrutable. I attempted to dismiss it, telling myself I was only dreaming things. After all, she was my employer, and I couldn't risk convincing myself differently. But one Friday evening, everything changed. It was late, and most of the office had left early. I was working on a last-minute report when Diane stopped by my desk, looking more weary than I had ever seen her. With a tired grin on her lips, she said, "How about one last catch-up before the weekend?" I followed her into her office, anticipating another weekly rundown, but once we were alone, I detected a change in the atmosphere. She closed the door, her palm resting on the doorknob for a second before turning to face me, leaning against her desk, arms folded. "You've really impressed me in the last several months." She started with a quieter tone than usual. "It's difficult to find somebody who can keep up with the speed around here." I attempted a grin to maintain my calm, but my heart was pounding. I wasn't sure whether it was her words or the way she looked at me, but something about this moment seemed tense, as if we were both on the verge of something neither of us wanted to admit. As she continued to speak, her tone softened, and I understood she wasn't simply admiring me. She was confiding in me. She spoke to me about the weight of duty, the personal sacrifices she'd made, and the nights she'd spent alone in our office, wondering whether it was all worthwhile. She glanced up, her eyes locked on mine, and for the first time, I felt as if I was seeing Diane as a person rather than my employer or the professional powerhouse everyone else recognized. Someone who, at that moment, felt as vulnerable and unsure as I did. Our talk faded as the minutes passed. I've lost count of time. Diane's laughter filled the room, and her guard was entirely down as she told tales about her history, trips, and ambitions outside the workplace boundaries. Her laughter was contagious, and I quickly found myself laughing with her, forgetting that there was anything between us. But the laughing faded, and we sat in quiet, the air between us charged with something I couldn't identify. She glanced at me, her face opaque, and I felt a rush of emotions that I couldn't contain. There was something in her eyes that made me believe I was the only one in the world who genuinely understood her. She broke the quiet, speaking just above a whisper. "I am not sure what I would do without these times." Her words were simple, but the weight of them was apparent. I wanted to answer with something that would express what I was feeling, but words failed me. I just nodded, hoping she realized for a little moment that we were just two people, two souls reaching out to each other in a world that sometimes seemed too huge and too fast. But then, as soon as the moment arrived, it vanished. She straightened and cleared her throat, as if to shake off the vulnerability she'd just shown. "Well," she said, her voice reverting to its regular calm tone, "I believe we should call it a night." I nodded, feeling a weird combination of disappointment and relief as I stood up to go. But when I approached the door, I felt a hand on my arm. I glanced around and she was standing closer than she had ever been before. Her eyes met mine, and for a brief time, I felt as if I could see into her soul. "Thank you," she added quietly, "for listening and being here." Her comments remained in the air as I exited her office, my head whirling from the enormity of what had just occurred. I couldn't escape the idea that we'd crossed a border and entered a place where nothing would ever be the same. Over the following several weeks, things changed in ways I wasn't prepared for. Diane and I continued to collaborate on numerous projects, and each time we were in her office, it seemed like there was an unseen thread linking us, one that we both appeared to be aware of but were too polite to mention. However, the air had altered. Small gestures, short looks, and periods of stillness seemed heated, almost as if they were talks. One late evening, I was finalizing a report when Diane's voice shouted out from her office, "Could you please come here for a moment?" Her tone was quiet and neutral, yet it conveyed something I couldn't pinpoint. I took a deep breath and brushed off my nervousness as I made my way to her office, attempting to seem casual despite the fact that my heart was pounding. When I walked in, she didn't glance up immediately away, interested in a paper on her desk. Finally, she laid down her pen, and her eyes met mine. "Close the door, would you?" Her request was simple, yet it seemed laden. I clicked the door shut abruptly, realizing that the office was absolutely vacant. Just the two of us, no distractions, No noise save the low hum of the air conditioner. "Sit down," she murmured, motioning to the chair in front of her desk as I nestled there. I observed something in her countenance that I hadn't seen before. She regarded me for a time, as if considering her remarks. "Recently, I've been thinking about connections." She started her speech somewhat hesitantly, revealing a rare sensitivity as she described how individuals cross paths for reasons we may never understand. "I, me, and you are here." I can't help but wonder whether she stopped catching herself, and for the first time I saw her falter. Her customary demeanor slipped. "Diane," I replied softly, leaning closer, feeling a pull from something deeper, something unspoken. "Is everything all right?" Her lips opened slightly, as if she wanted to say something important, something that would remove the cloud that surrounded us. But then she shook her head with a small grin, pulling at the corners of her lips. "I'm all right," she said, but her eyes betrayed her. Simply too many late nights. I assume we didn't say anything for a few seconds. The stillness permeated the room, yet it was not unpleasant. It seemed as if we were waiting, both knowing that this was not an ordinary chat. But as immediately as the opportunity arose, she drew back her professional mask, sliding back into place. "Let us go back to work," she urged. Her tone was suddenly fast and dismissive, as if she was attempting to erase what had just transpired. I nodded, feeling a weird combination of annoyance and need as I returned to my work. But deep down, I knew things were not as easy as she was attempting to make them. In the days after, I attempted to keep my distance to preserve a semblance of normality, but the memory of that night persisted, feeding an already high level of stress. I'd find myself glancing up from my desk and meeting her stare, both of us hurriedly turning away as if we'd been caught doing something wrong. Then one evening, something occurred. I was ready to leave when she beckoned me into her office. Her voice was soft and tentative. "Could you remain for a bit longer tonight? There is something I would want to discuss with you." It was a simple request, yet the weight of it seemed difficult to disregard. Inside her office, she stood at the window, looking out at the city lights. She looked buried in contemplation, and when she eventually turned to face me, her eyes were gentle and warm, which both reassured and troubled me. I closed the door behind me. As the tension coil tightened, she motioned for me to approach, pointing to a file on her desk. "I needed your thoughts on this," she murmured, just above a whisper. But as I got closer, our hands touched ever so barely, sending a thrill through me. I could feel her eyes on me, waiting for a response. I couldn't help it. I glanced up to meet her stare, and the air seemed thick with everything. We had both been holding back. Neither of us talked, but it seemed as if we were both quietly accepting what had been developing between us. "I'm not sure what I'm doing," she mumbled nearly to herself, her voice so soft I could hardly hear it. Her hand stayed close to mine, as if waiting for me to make the next step. Every instinct told me to back off and move away before things got out of control. But something else kept me glued in place. I can't leave without thinking. I reached for her hand and barely touched her fingers. It was a simple, almost innocent act, yet it felt momentous. She did not draw away. Instead, her fingers closed around mine, silently acknowledging everything. We were both too terrified to speak it out. "Diane," I said, but before I could continue, she shook her head and looked to the floor. "This isn't right," she explained. Her voice was filled with remorse, yet she made no effort to let go. "I've worked so hard to keep things professional in order to maintain control, but not with you. Her voice faded off, leaving the statement incomplete, but I got what she meant. She had attempted to maintain a professional distance, but something had shattered her resolve, putting us both in unfamiliar ground. I can sense too. I acknowledged my voice was hardly audible. I tried to ignore it, but I can't pretend anymore. For a time, we were simply standing there, our hands interlocked, each of us trying to make sense of what was going on. It was incorrect. We were both aware that she was my employer, and we were crossing a boundary that could not be undone. But, at that moment, the danger and the repercussions seemed remote and inconsequential. And then, as abruptly as the moment had began, she removed my hand and took a step back as if she had suddenly realized where we were. "This cannot happen," she firmly said, her voice reverting to the calm tone she was renowned for. "We cannot allow whatever it is interfere with our efforts." I nodded, swallowing a difficult sensation of disappointment and relief. "I understand." She nodded as well, but the strain in her countenance did not ease. "Maybe we should maintain our distance for a bit," she advised. Her remarks appeared to hurt, but her emphasis on business kept things professional. "Of course," I responded, but even as I say it, I knew it was a promise none of us could truly follow, because no matter how hard we tried to fool ourselves, something had changed between us, and there was no turning back. The days that followed were spent in an uneasy ballet of avoidance and stealth glances. We both attempted to behave as if nothing had occurred in order to make things seem normal. But every time our gazes met or we brushed by one another in the corridor, the unsaid tension sparked like lightning. Then one evening, as I was preparing my belongings to go, she came to my desk, her face inscrutable. "Are you going out?" she inquired with a casual tone, but her words had a slight edge that threw me off guard. I was about to respond, feeling my heart accelerate. "Can you spare a few minutes?" she asked, and notwithstanding her light tone, I sensed something deeper in her plea. Despite all she'd said, she was reaching out to me. I followed her back to her office, each step overwhelming me with both eagerness and fear. We'd been here before, these late evenings, the silent intensity that filled the air when we were alone, and when the door clicked shut behind us. I knew I couldn't deny the fact that this was not simply another talk. This was something more, something unavoidable. As the door closed behind me, a tense quiet enveloped the room. In the silence of her office, I could feel my heart beating faster with each beat. Diane's back was to me, her figure framed by the city lights beyond the window. She didn't say anything straight immediately. Instead, she remained motionless, her shoulders stiff as if locked in an internal conflict. I took a tentative step forward, uncertain if I should interrupt the stillness. "Diane," I whispered quietly, trying to relieve whatever was bothering her. She turned to face me, her eyes full with sorrow. I couldn't tell whether I was feeling vulnerable, frustrated, or something else that made my heart race. She examined me for a time, and I could see she was deciding how much to share and how much to risk. "I'm not sure what is going on here." She started with a barely audible whisper. I felt I had control, that I could keep things professional, and that any emotions I was experiencing would pass. But her voice drifted off as she moved closer. Her eyes focused on me. I swallowed the intensity of her gaze, which made it hard to turn away, but it hasn't changed. I inquired, my voice quivering slightly, and she shook her head with a small, resigned grin, plucking at the corner of her lips. "No, it hasn't," she said, her voice rough and honest. She put out her fingers and barely grazed my hand, sending a flood of fire through me. We stood there, scarcely touching, yet the tension between us was nearly excruciating. Before I realized what was occurring, Diane closed the distance between us, reaching up to slash my face. Her touch was soft and cautious, as if she were still holding back, scared to go all the way. I held my breath, every nerve in my body on edge, waiting for what I knew would happen. And suddenly, her lips touched mine. The kiss began softly and tentatively, as if we were both testing the waters to see how far we might go before entirely losing ourselves. But as the seconds went, the uncertainty faded, replaced by an increasing desperation that none of us could control. Her hands slid to the back of my neck, drawing me closer, and I felt myself react reflexively, throwing my arms around her as if frightened to let her go. Everything else fell away in that instant. The workplace, the regulations, and the penalties. All that mattered was the warmth of her body against mine, the feel of her lips, and the unsaid feelings that flowed between us. It was a connection that went beyond words, a spark that had been building up for so long that it seemed like a relief. Our kiss intensified. I felt her hands slide down my back, bringing me closer until there was no more room between us. Her breath felt warm on my face, and the quick pounding of her heart mirrored mine own. It was exhilarating and overpowering, and for the first time, I allowed myself to completely succumb to the moment of letting go. Among the many reasons why this should not be occurring. "Diane," I muttered, hardly able to find my voice as our lips separated. For a short time, she gazed up at me, her eyes dark and filled with feelings I'd never seen before. Her glance conveyed vulnerability and openness, which made my chest tense. "I shouldn't be doing this," she mumbled, but even as she spoke it, her fingers tightened on me, as if scared I'd vanish. But I refused to stop. "Then don't," I responded. My voice remained steady, and my determination was resolute. "We've been holding back for too long." She nodded, her reluctance melting away, and all the limits we'd placed for ourselves vanished. We lost ourselves in one other, our common restraint giving way to an intensity beyond our control. She drew me in closer, her lips pressing against mine again, this time more urgently and fervently. I could feel the depth of everything she'd been keeping back, the sentiments she'd attempted to hide, and it made me want her even more. We moved together, allowing the moment to devour us, with each kiss deeper and more daring. Her hands ran a route over my back, and I found myself leaning into her, matching her intensity, and allowing her to direct me. It felt as if we were both succumbing to something unavoidable, something that had been developing between us from the beginning. At one point, she pushed back, her breathing ragged and her eyes fierce. "I've been wanting this for so long," she acknowledged, her voice barely audible, and the vulnerability in her words drew me closer to her. "So, have I?" I responded. My voice was just as wobbly. "I just didn't think." She hushed me with another kiss, her hands running through my hair and drawing me further into her world. I could sense the hidden promises in every touch and caress. It was more than simply an attraction. It was a link that extended beyond reasoning and the roles we performed. In that moment, we were on equal footing, two individuals who had finally let their guard down. The hours passed in a rush, yet each second seemed like a lifetime, with every touch and gaze imprinted on my mind. We were lost in the blur of our connection, our bodies swaying together as if compelled by an unknown power. Time stopped still, and our surrounds faded into obscurity. Nothing existed save the warmth of her stare, her eyes looking deep inside me, and the wordless understanding that we shared. Every gaze and grin had a deep impact on our hearts, which were beating perfectly. Our closeness was apparent, as if we were engulfed by a live, breathing organism, and every moment was seared in my memory. The next several days seemed weird, as if I were living in two universes at once. In the office, Diane and I exchanged quick professional nods, as if nothing had occurred. But beyond the surface, I could still sense the echoes of that night's events, which had left an imprint and disturbed something deep inside each of us. Each gaze we exchanged was a quiet recollection, a reminder of what lay underneath the polished facade we showed to the world. The stress had just increased. It was a peculiar pleasure and a struggle to navigate the limits we had set in the aftermath of our relationship. I was continuously conscious of her presence every time she passed by my desk, and I saw how her gaze would occasionally stay just a little longer than needed. But one evening, things came to a head. It was Friday, the conclusion of a hard week, and the office had cleared out. Diane stopped by my desk. "Could we meet in the conference room?" she inquired in a calm, professional tone, but something in her gaze made my pulse accelerate. Of course. I answered in a calm tone, but my mind was already racing. I packed my belongings and followed her thoughts, a combination of excitement and trepidation. She moved ahead, and as we entered the conference room, she closed the door behind us and turned to face me with a look I couldn't interpret. "We need to speak," she began, her voice calm but soft, and I knew this would be unlike any previous discussion we'd had. I took a seat, watching her pace for a minute before settling down across from me. This is what occurred between us. Her eyes started to meet mine. It was genuine, and I do not regret it. Her comments lingered in the air, each one echoing with an honesty that took me by surprise. But we can't keep pretending that it hasn't had an impact and will not influence how we collaborate. I nodded, realizing the significance of what she was saying. "I know," I responded. My voice scarcely rose beyond a whisper. "I've been experiencing that too." She groaned and clutched her hands firmly in front of her, as if to steady herself. "I've been in this field long enough to understand what happens when personal and professional boundaries merge." She maintained her unrelenting focus, and I care too much about my work and you to allow this go out of hand. Hearing her acknowledge that she cared about me gave me a nice feeling, but it was bittersweet, tinged with the reality of what we both knew would happen next. "So, what should we do?" I asked. I'm struggling to keep my emotions in control. Diane hesitated, her gaze softening as she leaned forward. Perhaps she said, "We slowly give it room. Allow things to settle, concentrate on our task, but do not deny what occurred or pretend it is unimportant." Her remarks were thoughtful and methodical, and I knew she was attempting to strike a balance, to keep what we had shared from consuming us. I nodded, feeling a combination of relief and grief. "I believe I can do it," I replied, although a part of me knew it would be more difficult than I wanted to acknowledge. We sat in quiet for a time, digesting the enormity of the choice. Each of us was aware that we were taking the careful approach, which would safeguard everything we had fought so hard for. However, as much as it hurt, I had to back away. I admired her even more for her candor, her willingness to, face the realities of our predicament. When we eventually exited the conference room, the office was abandoned, with the building's peaceful hum standing in sharp contrast to the tumult within me. I escorted her to the elevator, our footsteps booming down the empty corridor, and we waited silently, each buried in our own thoughts. When the elevator came, she turned to face me, her eyes sweet yet determined. "Take care of yourself," she said, a slight grin on her lips. "And remember, this isn't the end. We're simply looking for a means to go ahead." "I understand," I responded, feeling an odd combination of closure and longing. "Thank you for everything." The doors closed, and I watched her depart. I felt a gentle sensation of acceptance wash over me. I knew we'd made the proper choice, that we'd selected a route that valued both of our lives and prospects. However, it did not make the sensations any simpler to ignore. In the weeks that followed, Diane and I kept a polite distance, concentrating on our job and eventually returning to the rhythm of our professional duties. The initial tension eased, giving way to a mutual understanding and a calm appreciation for the bond we had. And there were times when I caught myself recalling her touch, her warmth. I knew what we had shared would always be a part of me, a memory that I would cherish. One day, as I was finishing up a report, she came by my desk, her face placid, but her eyes full of the person she had showed me in those quiet times we had spent. "I wanted to thank you," she added, her voice calm, "for understanding and being precisely who I expected you to be." Her comments shocked me, and a warm sensation ran through me. A quiet confirmation that reminded me of why I was attracted to her in the first place. "Thank you," I answered with a slight grin. Crossing my lips for everything, she offered a little nod, and for a few time, it seemed as if nothing had changed, as if we were back in that office, enjoying a connection that went beyond the walls that separated us. But then, with a modest grin, she turned and went away, leaving me with a sensation of calm, as if, despite the limits we had established, we had both discovered something significant, something worth cherishing. Months passed, and life resumed its steady march onward. Our conversations reverted to a warm professionalism, the kind of connection we had always had before things changed. We reconnected as colleagues with a common understanding that didn't have to be spoken loudly, a tacit acceptance of the depth that lurked under the surface, even if the strength of our connection had diminished. I knew those experiences would have a lasting influence on me. They had formed me, taught me to cherish sincerity, and to recognize the quiet power of mutual respect and understanding. In the years that followed, I saw Diane continue to flourish in her work, reaching new heights as she took on jobs that required all of her skill and grit. She remained a guiding influence in my life, someone I looked up to not just as a mentor, but also as a friend. Someone who had taught me the power of vulnerability and the bravery to confront tough choices with grace. Occasionally, when we were alone, we would exchange a short glance, a memory of a relationship that had once transformed both of us. It was enough to remind us that we had shared something unique and meaningful, something that had enhanced both of our lives in ways we could never properly articulate. Time has a way of putting things in perspective and illuminating the significance of events we may have previously taken for granted. Looking back, I am glad for the trip we took together, for the lessons we gained, and for the quiet strength of a relationship that beyond expectations. And as I progressed in my life, I made new relationships and pursued new aspirations. I took with me Diane's memories, which reminded me of the beauty of sincerity, the strength of human connection, and the calm resilience that we all possess. Our narrative ended without great gestures or emotional farewells. Instead, it became a part of who I am, a subtle presence that formed me and taught me to treasure the moments that actually count, the individuals who make an everlasting impression on our lives. At the finish, I knew our relationship was special and would always be a part of my tale. It was a chapter I would remember with appreciation, respect, and maybe a tinge of regret for the route we had decided not to walk. However, life is full with choices, both chosen and untaken. And although our voyage together had come to an end, it left me with a deep feeling of understanding, a reminder that certain relationships are intended to be felt, treasured, and then gently relinquished. And when I look back, I've realized that often the most impactful tales are the ones that remain and shape us long after the last words are said.